Chapter 9 Algo Traders. After Pete sent the warning to Sosh and Logic, he turned to look at the man who had asked him to choose between a rock and a hard place at a moment's notice. He was impressed with the man's prowess with words. Looking at him, he was also impressed with his looks. Even though he did not look much older than Pete himself, Roderick Perkins was a well-groomed man. He looked to be about 6 foot tall and muscular. He seemed to be someone who could handle himself in a tight spot. He also looked as though he had never done a day's worth of work with his hands. When he shook hands with Pete, his hands felt softer than veal. Pete was not sure how he was supposed to address him, and he wasn't even sure why he had trusted him. In a situation like this, how could you trust anyone? Pete wondered to himself, preferring to keep quiet at the moment, as he was not sure what, if anything, he was supposed to say. He also wanted the initiative to be taken by the people who had asked him to make this impossible choice. Pete was wondering at that moment why they had waited until that moment to come and rescue him. Had Sebastian wanted to help him, Pete was sure the genius man could have found other ways. Something didn't add up. He just couldn't put his finger on the issue. At that moment, Pete's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and musings. Had he come to me at any other time, I wouldn't have given him the time of day, let alone placed my trust. I think he knows that. Pete was in the middle of studying Roderick, almost unobtrusively. Pete wanted to find the answers to a lot of questions about the situation he had landed upon. He wanted to know why the man worked with Sebastian in the first place. Was their relationship more than work? Did Roderick owe Sebastian anything? It was an important factor in Pete's calculations. He wanted to know if he could at least partially trust whatever information Roderick gave him. This would also answer the next question. How loyal was he to Sebastian? He was worried that Roderick would not hesitate to manipulate facts in his favor, ensuring the hacker believed in whatever Sebastian had to say or offer. Why am I even thinking about such a complicated thing? At this point, I don't even know what Sebastian wants from me. One thing I can be sure of is whatever it is, it cannot be anything too easy or legitimate. These thoughts were interrupted by Roderick, who spoke suddenly, turning back to Pete. Roderick placed his cell phone on the little nook beside him and half turned to look at Pete fully in the eye. Do you know anything about algo trading, Mr. Pete? Vaguely, Pete lied outright. Pete wanted Roderick to answer his question, as he knew that the more he made Roderick talk, the more likely he was to warm up to Pete and spill something useful. It was a trick he had learned from Sosh. For a moment, Roderick looked as though he was mentally turning on his teaching mode. Roderick was clearly expecting Pete to say something along the lines of, "No, I don't know anything about algo trading," and had prepared his response accordingly. Algorithmic trading is a method of executing a large order using automated pre-programmed trading instructions, accounting for variables such as time, price, and volume to send small slices of the order out to the market over time. Okay, Pete responded after hearing the definition given in that way. Pete was not sure if Roderick wanted him to understand it or just memorize it, as he had done. Anyway, Pete decided he was just going to play along and nod his head for as long as necessary. He needed to find out what the hell was happening. He wanted some answers and was worried about his team, as well as Tosh. It was around the 3-hour mark when the car stopped at a private airstrip, and Pete was asked by Roderick to follow him. As Pete got out of the car and followed the assistant, he asked him where they were going. To Mr. Farrow's private jet, was Roderick's succinct reply. The private jet that Roderick was talking about turned out to be a huge plane. It was not as big as a commercial plane, but it was bigger than the normal private jets Pete had seen. After a basic inquiry, Pete got to know from Roderick that there were 5 bedrooms, fully functional bathrooms, a dining room, a movie theater for 11 people, as well as a full functional kitchen with a chef on board. There were a bar room and an office inside the behemoth. Pete was surprised as he got on board. Even with the description Roderick had given him, he was not expecting to see the lavish sight that greeted his eyes as he mounted the stairs and entered the belly of the plane. The interior of the aircraft was done in a modern yet classic style. It was so artfully executed that from the inside, it did not remotely resemble an airplane. It was as though he had walked into the entrance hall of a magnificent yet modern palace. As Pete went deeper and deeper into the plane, everything started to take on a more surreal feel. 2 days ago, he was running frantically for his life, barefoot out of his apartment, leaving his girlfriend behind. And a week ago, he had been planning the biggest heist of the century with the Chinese, who a few hours ago had tried to kill him. On board the plane, Roderick showed Pete everything, and he was even taken into the kitchen, where the chef informed him that everything on the menu was available, and Pete could ask for anything he wanted any time. In fact, he had already taken the liberty of preparing a soup for him, and he wanted Pete to be well fed. Pete was taken aback by the hospitality of the chef. After talking to him, Pete was led back into the dining room, where both of them sat down to have some excellent chicken soup with dumplings. Pete was beyond amazed, and Roderick was clearly enjoying seeing his reactions. As they were finishing their soup, 2 waiters stepped in to take their bowls and gave them each an elaborate menu. After going through it twice, Pete ordered the rigatoni al segreto, beef rouladen with a side of creamed spinach, loaded baked potatoes, and truffle potato gratin. Pete also ordered the caviar platter, saying, "I always wanted to know what the fuss was about fish eggs." Roderick, who had ordered only Spanish octopus with a side of mashed potatoes, was looking at Pete with an amused look on his face, especially when he made the comment about fish eggs and ordered 2 of the most expensive things on the menu, caviar and truffles. As soon as the food arrived, the 2 men busied themselves with eating. Pete ate with delight. He was starving and had not had a proper meal for 2 days. Even though he was worried and apprehensive about the day's events, he was tired and hungry enough to be thankful for having good food in front of him. While they were eating, Roderick, who was a great conversationalist, broke the silence with facts about the plane they were on and a few random details about Mr. Farrow. On one occasion, Roderick told Pete, "Did you know Mr. Farrow speaks very highly of you and your skills?" Pete was taken aback by the comment, even though he knew that Sebastian wanted to recruit him. He did not know that Sebastian had spoken about him with his employees. However, Pete was starting to have serious doubts about his knowledge of the millionaire. In fact, he did not even know that you could live a life like the one he was experiencing. The private jet, the exquisite food served by waiters, the lavish and stylish decor. Pete was enamored by the whole deal. Although, at the back of his thoughts, he knew that it might very well be a tactic that the millionaire was using with Pete in order to show superiority and overpower him through sheer force of his wealth. Pete was now thinking that he was going to try to work with this man, because both of them knew that Pete was not in any position to negotiate or have an alternative choice. As they were talking and these thoughts were going through Pete's mind, it was time to land. They had reached New York, and Pete thought that it was finally time to meet the man responsible for saving his life last night. As they deplaned, no one asked them for identification, seeming to know Roderick on sight. They walked through airport security and customs without any trouble. The White Plains New York Airport was a private hangar, as well as an airport. At the other end was parked a black Cadillac Escalade SUV that was to take them to a New York hotel. Pete was still feeling amazed and felt as though he was in a dream as he got into the shiny black car. Even though his father had money and Pete had grown up in a comfortable house and enjoyed a comfortable life, he was not used to this lavish lifestyle. As they drove toward their destination, Pete thought about Tosh. He was wishing with all his might that she was here with him. Even though she was not accustomed to all the lavishness around him at the moment, he was sure that Tosh would have been unperturbed by it. He was also sure that no matter what he was wishing for at the moment, leaving Tosh behind had been a good decision. She was now in the clear, which certainly would not have been the case if she was on the run with him. Now that Pete was thinking about Tosh, his mind conjured up the image of their last meeting together. They had been alone for the first time in what felt like forever, and they had spent a couple of hours together. They had both eaten and were cuddling on the couch, when suddenly Tosh turned to him and hugged him really tight and whispered that she loved him a lot. Pete remembered how overcome with emotions he had felt at that time, and how passionate their kiss had been after that. He felt his cheeks flush from the thought of what happened after the kiss. Pete did not know if Roderick was watching him, or even if anyone observing him could see the flush of his cheeks or the slight watering of his eyes. He was missing Tosh so bad that it was a physical pain in his chest. He wanted her with him, and his mind told him that she was better off without him. He was suddenly jolted from his reflections by the stopping of the SUV. When he looked up, they had come to a stop in front of the beautiful and historical Peninsula Hotel, which was located on Fifth Ave. He was at the grandest hotel in the city that never slept. Pete understood why New York was called the city that never sleeps. Everyone he saw the instant he got out looked uber busy. They were all rushing off and were so absorbed in their devices that they had no time even to glance at all the beautiful shops and hotels around them. To them, it was a part of their daily view. Pete's attention was diverted to the marvelous sights in front of him, especially the hotel they had stopped in front of. "You have a meeting with Mr. Farrow at 8 p.m. He has asked that you have dinner with him. It is 7 p.m. now, so I will come around 7:45 p.m. with a car to pick you up. I have to go to the office for some work. Goodbye." Roderick was speaking professionally, yet in a hurried manner at the same time. How he managed to convey both these feelings in the same sentence was beyond Pete, who had just observed him do so. They had also been walking the whole time, so by the time Roderick finished his sentence, they were at the reception desk, and Roderick handed a piece of paper to the concierge, who saluted him as though he knew him well, which in all probability he did, and looked at the card. As soon as Roderick entered whatever was in front of him, the concierge replied, "Sir, you are situated in the executive suite with the Central Park view." They took the keycard from the concierge, and Roderick led Pete to the banks of elevators just off the main lobby. As the two of them walked, Roderick continued what he was saying. "I took the liberty of ordering some clothes for you. They should be in the closet of your suite. You're about a large size, right?" Pete nodded his head, and Roderick continued by saying, "Mr. Farrow lives around the corner. He lives at a prehistorical building overlooking Central Park in the penthouse." Handing Pete a cell phone, Roderick said, "This is your temporary phone. It is untraceable and you can call me any time. My number is already saved in it." As Roderick said this, the elevator dinged in front of them and the doors opened. "I have to hurry back to the office. You can order anything from room service," Roderick said to Pete with a smile and a wink, waving goodbye, and hurried back to the waiting car. Pete rode up the elevator alone and thought to himself that he should have at least insisted on bringing Sosh and Logic with him. He knew both of them were smart enough to evade the police as well as the Chinese, who were for the most part after him first. He was sure that they would be safe here, but wanted to check in and make sure. He wanted to send them a message on the dark web, but for that, he needed a computer, and he was going to have to wait for Mr. Farrow to provide him with one. The elevator stopped, jolting Pete out of his thoughts. He got out and found directions to the executive suite. The doors were made of a polished wood that gleamed. As he entered, he saw a living room that was decked out in soft cream and beige, with an accent of pastel peach. The suite looked just magnificent. When he entered his bedroom, he was stunned by the view. From the floor to ceiling windows, he had never seen so many lights. They looked like stars twinkling just outside of his window. After a while, he realized that he was filthy and decided to take a shower, stepping into the walk-in closet, where he was stunned that Roderick had bought so many clothes for him. Walking into the bathroom left him speechless as well. The full-size bathtub was more than big enough for him. It could have accommodated 3 of him. The floor was a luxurious-feeling marble, and the vanity in the bathroom was made from grayish wood that felt like silk under his fingertips. He was amazed at the quality of life that existed in the hotel, and for people like Sebastian Farrow. As soon as Pete stepped into the shower, he was once again reminded of Tosh. He was wishing now more than ever that she was with him. He wanted to share the giant bathtub with her. "Well, I can't do that, so what is the next best thing?" he thought to himself. Making up his mind, Pete decided to call Tosh with the newly acquired phone. But that could happen, for now. His thoughts focused upon what his purpose was here. He was sure Sebastian wanted him to get a taste of a good life, and then offer him to keep it. Pete was sure that was going to be his tactic, and had already come up with a decision that he was going to accept it, as long as it was not too out there. He was, after all, in dire need of some help. It was better to earn help rather than owe someone. The thing Pete was puzzled with was, why did Sebastian want him in the first place? And why would he go through all the trouble for him? He knew he was good, but there must be other people dying for an opportunity like this. Then why was Mr. Farrow going to such lengths to appease Pete alone? "I think I should check up on Mr. Farrow some more. But I should call Tosh first," Pete said as he dialed her number and waited for her to pick up. After 3 rings, Tosh picked up and said hello. "Hey, babe, how are you?" "Oh, hey, babe. I'm okay, just a bit of an upset stomach. I am also missing you a lot. How are you guys? What's happening? I didn't tell anything to the police. They just told me to stay in town, and now they are just not that keen on asking me questions. I haven't heard from Richard either." Tosh was speaking rapidly, as though she had been keeping everything in up until the moment Pete had called, and now everything was spilling out. She was relieved to hear his voice, who was feeling a similar sense of relief. However, he was put out to hear that she was not feeling completely okay. He wanted to take care of her and make chicken soup when she was sick. Pete told her, "Oh, babe, it's okay. I feel much better now that I know you're okay." Pete could tell from her tone that she was smiling. He was glad that he made her smile. She was the best thing that had happened in his whole life, and he wanted to keep her safe. He knew now that he was not going to strike a deal with Sebastian until he could guarantee that she was going to be safe from now on. As soon as Pete thought about Sebastian, Pete realized that he had an internet search to complete, and the time for his meeting with the business tycoon was coming up fast. So even though he wanted to spend hours talking on the phone, he was forced to say goodbye to Tosh. "Babe, I have to go now. I know you have a lot of questions, and I will answer as many as I can the next time I am able to call you. I am getting a few answers myself. You can call me on this number if you have an emergency. Wait for my call. I want to talk to you in detail, my love." Pete said all this to Tosh in a hurry, and she replied with a quick, "Okay, love, take care, and I am waiting for you to call back." Sensing his haste, Pete changed into a pair of jeans that felt expensive as hell, a shirt from Burberry, and original Nike sneakers. He had never owned anything this expensive all his life, even though he had worn good clothes. Anyway, as soon as he was done getting dressed, he took out his phone once again and this time opened up a browser and typed in Sebastian Farrow on the search bar. The first result was Sebastian Farrow profile. Sebastian Farrow is the founder and CEO of SF Capital Investment Group, SF Capital Investment Group, SFCIG, investment hedge fund company. Pete opened up another result and found Sebastian Farrow's titles: top investor under 30, 15 billion in capital investments. Most influential financial investor under 40. Many of the articles written about Sebastian stated that he had started from humble beginnings. Farrow and his parents had migrated to the U.S. as stowaways on a boat from Cuba when he was 9 years old. He had then stayed at a refugee camp until they were granted permanent residence. It was then that they moved to Croton on the Hudson in Westchester County in New York. There, his mother worked as a nanny and his father was a gardener for wealthy families in the county. When Sebastian grew up, he eventually got in CUNY, Baruch College, New York, as he was an extremely hard-working student, as well as an exceptionally gifted one. He got his BBA in finance from CUNY and began working on Wall Street, never looking back on his humble beginnings. Now, apart from his $2 billion in assets, one article stated, he owned a 6-bedroom apartment in a prehistoric building overlooking Central Park, a 6-bedroom and 8-bathroom house at West Bay Estate in Grand Cayman, an 8-bedroom house in Greenwich, Connecticut, a 6-bedroom and 3-bathroom apartment he bought 3 years ago in Notting Hill, London, which is currently valued at 3,600,000 GBP. As Pete was reading this, the time slowly ran to 7:45 p.m. The driver who was supposed to pick him up from the hotel had shown up 20 minutes early and was waiting downstairs. Pete got in the car and arrived at the new destination within 7 minutes, even with the horrific NYC traffic, as the driver was highly skilled. As Pete got out, the concierge came outside to escort him into the building and told him that Mr. Farrow was expecting him and that his apartment was on the top floor, which was the penthouse suite. Pete got into the elevator that was waiting for him, and before he could ask about Mr. Farrow's apartment number, the doors closed. However, he needed not to worry, as when the doors to the elevator opened, they opened up into an elegant and tastefully decorated foyer. A lady in housekeeping uniform was standing in front of the elevator. Pete realized that the elevator was the door to the penthouse apartment, and Mr. Farrow's suite occupied the whole top floor. The housekeeping lady greeted Pete in perfectly cultured English. "Welcome, Mr. Pete. If you will follow me, I will take you to Mr. Farrow. He is waiting for you in his study." The entire apartment was decorated with the thought in mind that it was a bachelor's apartment. The color contrast was created with white and dark colors like jade green and midnight blue. It was an elemental kind of an apartment, with exposed wooden beams and accent walls made out of stone, which looked magnificent. The fireplace in the living area was a work of art that was made with red bricks and was huge. As Pete entered the study, he saw the same to be true for the fireplace there. The library was a high-ceilinged room that was supported by exposed wooden beams and stonework walls. The floor was also made of wood. As soon as Pete entered, he tried to take in everything at once. However, the man standing by the fireplace caught his attention. He looked to be a man in his 30s, and from his demeanor, seemed to be easygoing. The apartment matched his personality perfectly. It was cultured and unique, with streaks of raw emotions visible every once in a while. Like right now, it was of amusement. "Welcome to my humble abode," Sebastian said with a flourish. "I trust you had a good flight." The last sentence was more of a statement than a question. Sebastian knew that he had provided every comfort to Pete. Sebastian gestured to Pete to come and join him by the fireplace. They sat on the large chairs that were right in front of it, and Pete almost felt lost in them. That is how big they were. However, Sebastian sat commandingly in his chair. Pete was impressed so far from all that he had seen and read about the man. After a little pause, Sebastian jumped right in, without any preamble. "I know the Chinese are looking for you, and they are angry. Come see for yourself," Sebastian said, getting up from his chair and going over to the desk, where the latest monitor was hooked up to a futuristic-looking device that supposedly was the CPU. The technology on display impressed Pete a lot. However, the dialogue box that opened up in front of him on the monitor made his heart sink down into his shoes. "We have been monitoring the Chinese through my source in that area of the world. As you can see, the Chinese are out for blood, and the police are searching for you as well. Don't worry. I won't turn you in." Sebastian added the last part with a warm smile for Pete. "We can help each other. You have a special set of skills that I can utilize to assist me to make financial decisions, and you need a place to stay while the Chinese settle down. This is a win-win scenario." At this, Pete was puzzled because he was a tech guy, not a finance guru. He did not believe that he had such good concepts about finance as to help Sebastian Farrow, who was a legend in the industry. Before Pete could say anything, Sebastian added, "Come work for me. You will be highly compensated for it. In the finance game, Pete, whoever predicts the market wins, and they win big. I want you to be my crystal ball, my god, my eyes to look into the market. Will you help me?" The last part was said with genuine warmth. Pete was still confused. However, he needed to accept the offer because he knew he was in no position to refuse, and he needed all the help he could get. He was thinking that taking the help of a powerful man like Sebastian could really help him, and that it was better to take help from someone you can repay immediately, rather than incur their debt. "I will try," Pete said to Sebastian in a low voice. "That is all any of us can hope to do," replied the business tycoon with a smile. "Let's connect tomorrow morning for work. Right now we have an excellent meal waiting for us. I will show you my home after dinner, and my office the next morning. Right now, we go eat, as I am starving," Sebastian said with relish, sounding as though he really was hungry. What would tomorrow bring? Only time will tell, it seems. Please pick up the second book, Rise of the CEOs and We Are Back, from the Dark Cumulus series at your nearest bookstore or on Amazon.com.